Morning, July 12, 1943. Southwest of Prokhorovka, Soviet Union. Lieutenant Anatoly Kozlov stood in the turret of his T-34 medium tank, hands gripping the cold steel rim as violet signal flares pierced the pre-dawn haze. The wheat fields stretched endlessly before him, golden stalks ready for harvest, swaying gently in the morning breeze. The air carried the sharp smell of diesel fuel mixed with summer grain and the metallic tang of lubricating oil. Behind him, stretching back for kilometers, the rumble of 500 Soviet tank engines created a sound like continuous distant thunder, making the earth itself seem to vibrate. Ahead, somewhere beyond the morning mist and rolling hills, waited the most elite armored formations Germany had ever fielded. Kozlov was 23 years old. He had survived the horror of Stalingrad 6 months earlier, had seen his closest friends burn alive inside steel coffins that became their tombs. He had learned to fear and hate the German Tiger, tanks with their impossibly thick armor and devastating 88mm, guns that could destroy a T-34 from distances where his own weapon was utterly useless. But this morning was fundamentally different from every battle he had fought before. Today, General Pavel Rotmistrov had committed the entire 5th Guards tank army to a massive counterattack. Today, the mathematics of armored warfare would shift. Today, Soviet numerical superiority would be tested against German technical excellence in the largest concentrated tank battle in human history. At exactly 6:30 in the morning, the code word crackled through Kozlov's radio headset. "Steel! Steel! Steel! The attack order!" Kozlov felt his stomach tighten. His driver, a 19-year-old farm boy from Ukraine named Dmitry, glanced up at him through the open turret hatch, his young face showing the peculiar mixture of terror and determination that Kozlov had seen so many times before. Kozlov nodded once. Dmitry gunned the V2 diesel engine. The T-34 lurched forward, tracks biting into the soft earth. Around them, an entire armored army began to move, hundreds of tanks advancing across the gentle hills toward an enemy that had dominated European warfare for 4 years. This was the Battle of Prokhorovka, the climactic moment of Operation Citadel, Hitler's last great offensive gamble on the Eastern Front. What happened here in these wheat fields and across these gentle hills of southwestern Russia would determine whether Nazi Germany could regain the strategic initiative in the East, whether the Wehrmacht could prove it still possessed the capability to conduct massive offensive operations, whether German armor remained supreme. The outcome would ripple across the entire course of World War II, establishing patterns and precedents that would shape warfare for generations to come. The path to this confrontation had been long and bloody. After the catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943, where an entire army had been encircled and destroyed, where over 90,000 German soldiers had surrendered in what became the greatest military humiliation in German history, Adolf Hitler desperately needed a victory. His generals needed to demonstrate that the Wehrmacht retained offensive capability, that German tactical and technological superiority could still dominate the battlefield, that the Eastern Front could be stabilized before the entire Nazi Empire collapsed. They studied their maps obsessively, looking for opportunity, searching for weakness, seeking the perfect place to strike. Near the city of Kursk, approximately 300 miles south of Moscow, the Soviet front line bulged westward into German-held territory. A salient military planners called it. 70 miles deep, over 100 miles wide at its base. Inside that bulge sat hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers, thousands of tanks, countless artillery pieces, entire armies deployed in defensive positions. The German plan was elegantly simple in conception, if extraordinarily difficult in execution. Strike from north and south simultaneously, cut through the base of the salient, encircle everything inside, destroy the trapped Soviet forces. This would eliminate an enormous Soviet military presence, straighten the German defensive line, create opportunities for further operations, and demonstrate to Stalin and the world that Germany still possessed the military capacity to win the war in the East. Hitler personally named the operation Citadel, invoking images of fortress sieges and medieval combat. But he delayed the offensive repeatedly throughout the spring of 1943, each postponement pushing the attack date further forward, giving the Soviets more precious time to prepare, to dig deeper trenches, to lay more extensive minefields, to position more anti-tank guns, to construct more defensive fortifications. Hitler insisted on waiting for more Tiger tanks to arrive at the front, more of the new Panther tanks to be delivered, more of the heavy armor that would provide Germany with what he believed was insurmountable technological advantage. His field commanders grew increasingly anxious with each delay. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South and arguably the most capable operational commander Germany possessed, repeatedly warned Hitler that every additional day of delay meant the loss of tactical surprise, that the Soviets were clearly using the time to massively strengthen their defenses, that the window of opportunity was rapidly closing. But Hitler remained convinced that technological superiority would prove decisive. He believed that Tigers with their 88mm guns and massive armor protection, that Panthers with their sophisticated sloped armor design and high-velocity 75mm guns, that these magnificent war machines would prove unstoppable. He was absolutely right that these weapons mattered enormously. He was catastrophically wrong about whether they would prove decisive. Because what Hitler failed to fully comprehend, what German military planning had consistently underestimated throughout the war, was that modern industrialized warfare would ultimately be decided not primarily by tactical brilliance, not by operational genius, not even by technological superiority, but by industrial capacity multiplied by raw productive volume. By the summer of 1943, the fundamental nature of armored warfare had evolved beyond what German doctrine had anticipated. This would not resemble France in 1940, where German panzer formations had run wild through unprepared and demoralized Allied forces that lacked doctrine for countering mobile warfare. This would not even resemble the early campaigns in Russia during 1941 and 1942, where Wehrmacht formations had repeatedly encircled and destroyed entire Soviet armies through superior mobility, superior training, superior tactical execution. The Soviets had learned from their catastrophic early defeats. They had adapted their doctrine, improved their training, reorganized their command structure, and most critically, they had built weapon systems specifically designed to fight German armor. The technological centerpiece of Soviet armored power was the T-34 medium tank, and by 1943 it was no longer Germany's secret nightmare, but a thoroughly understood, deeply respected and sometimes genuinely feared opponent. The T-34 had first appeared in combat during the summer of 1941 and had immediately shocked German tank crews who encountered it. Its revolutionary sloped armor design could deflect shots that would easily penetrate the vertical armor plates of German Panzer III tanks. Its powerful 76mm gun could destroy any German tank then in service from ranges that German tank crews found alarming. Its extraordinarily wide tracks gave it mobility across mud and snow that routinely mired German tanks with their much narrower track designs. Its diesel engine, while prone to mechanical problems, was substantially less likely to catch fire when hit compared to the gasoline engines powering German tanks. When senior German commanders first encountered detailed reports about the T-34's capabilities, when they examined captured examples, when they realized the extent of Soviet technological achievement, several generals seriously recommended that Germany should simply copy the T-34 design, build Soviet tanks using German manufacturing quality and precision engineering, abandon current German tank development programs entirely in favor of producing a proven, effective design. But German pride, German bureaucratic complexity, German attachment to existing industrial arrangements, and Hitler's personal technological preferences prevented any such pragmatic solution. Instead, Germany responded to the T-34 threat by developing even heavier armor, even more powerful guns, even more sophisticated and complex tank designs. The Tiger heavy tank emerged from this response, weighing 57 tons, protected by armor plates up to 4 inches thick on the frontal surfaces, armed with the legendary 88mm gun that had originally been designed as an anti-aircraft weapon. The Tiger represented the pinnacle of German armored engineering. Its 88mm gun could destroy a T-34 at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, distances where the Soviet tank's 76mm gun was completely ineffective against the Tiger's massive frontal armor. A single Tiger tank could dominate an entire battlefield sector, could destroy Soviet tanks one after another, from ranges where return fire was impossible, could advance with near impunity against opponents who lacked weapons capable of penetrating its armor. But there existed a fundamental, ultimately insurmountable problem with the German technological approach. These magnificent machines were extraordinarily difficult to manufacture, required precision components that only specialized factories could produce, demanded enormous quantities of strategic materials, including chrome and molybdenum, that Germany was increasingly struggling to obtain, and took vastly longer to build than simpler tank designs. Tiger production never exceeded 25 tanks per month during the entire war. 25. The Panther was somewhat better in terms of production volume, with manufacturing eventually reaching approximately 300 tanks per month at peak output. But even these impressive production numbers were woefully inadequate for the scale of warfare being conducted on the Eastern Front. Meanwhile, Soviet factories were producing T-34s in truly staggering quantities. During 1943 alone, Soviet industry delivered more than 15,000 T-34 tanks to the Red Army. 15,000. To put this in perspective, the entire German armoured force deployed across the entire Eastern Front in mid-1943 numbered perhaps 3,000 operational tanks of all types combined. The mathematics of industrial warfare were brutal, simple, and utterly inescapable. Germany could design better tanks, could build more sophisticated tanks, could field more technologically advanced tanks, but the Soviet Union could build vastly more tanks. This fundamental asymmetry between technological quality and industrial quantity would ultimately prove decisive, not just at Prokhorovka, but throughout the remainder of the war. By early July 1943, both sides had completed their preparations for what both understood would be a decisive engagement. The Germans had concentrated their available armoured forces for Operation Citadel with unusual thoroughness. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge's 9th Army would strike southward from the northern shoulder of the Kursk salient. Manstein's forces, led by the 4th Panzer Army under General Hermann Hoth, would strike northward from the southern shoulder. The two forces would meet somewhere east of Kursk, completing the encirclement and trapping everything between them. The plan appeared straightforward on maps. Its execution would prove anything but simple. Operation Citadel began on July 5, 1943. In the northern sector, Model's 9th Army made initial progress penetrating Soviet defensive lines, then ground to a catastrophic halt against prepared Soviet defenses that proved far more formidable than German intelligence had anticipated. Soviet engineers had constructed 8 successive defensive belts stretching back for over 100 miles, each belt consisting of interlocking trenches, anti-tank ditches, extensive minefields, prepared artillery positions, interlocking fields of fire for anti-tank guns, and carefully concealed tank positions that could engage advancing German armour from unexpected angles. The Germans discovered that every metre of advance came at terrible cost. German tanks triggered mines, got caught in tank traps, came under devastating artillery fire, found themselves engaged by anti-tank guns firing from carefully camouflaged positions at close range, where even lighter anti-tank weapons could penetrate armour. Within 4 days, Model's offensive had effectively stalled. The 9th Army was stuck, unable to advance, taking heavy casualties, consuming irreplaceable men and equipment in what had become a grinding attritional battle that played to Soviet strengths. In the southern sector, Manstein's 4th Panzer Army achieved substantially better results. Leading the attack was the II SS Panzer Corps commanded by SS Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser, one of the most experienced and capable armoured commanders Germany possessed. The corps consisted of 3 elite divisions, each named after Nazi ideological concepts, and each representing the absolute peak of German military capability. Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, originally Hitler's personal bodyguard unit, had evolved into a full armoured division with combat experience across multiple theatres. Das Reich, similarly experienced and equipped, had fought in France, the Balkans, and extensively in Russia. Totenkopf, whose skull and crossbones insignia had originated in the Death's Head Hussars of Prussian military tradition, was equally experienced and equally capable. Together, these 3 divisions fielded approximately 400 tanks and assault guns at the beginning of the operation. This was not an overwhelming number in absolute terms, but these were elite units with veteran crews, well-maintained equipment, excellent officers, and superb tactical doctrine executed with near-perfect precision. The II SS Panzer Corps punched through the 1st Soviet defensive belt on July 5th. They penetrated the 2nd defensive belt on July 6th. By July 9th, they had broken through the 3rd defensive belt and were advancing toward a small railway town named Prokhorovka. The town itself possessed minimal strategic value, just a railway junction with some grain warehouses and a few hundred civilians. But Prokhorovka controlled the routes leading northeast toward Kursk and eastward towards Soviet rear areas. If the Germans could capture Prokhorovka and secure the roads beyond it, They could potentially swing northeast behind the main Soviet defensive lines, threatening to encircle huge portions of the Soviet forces defending the southern face of the Kursk salient. The entire southern front might collapse. Operation Citadel might actually achieve its objectives. General Nikolai Vatutin, commanding the Voronezh front responsible for defending the southern approaches to Kursk, saw this threat with perfect clarity. His forces had fought skillfully and bravely, had imposed heavy casualties on the advancing Germans, had traded space for time exactly as Soviet defensive doctrine prescribed. But now the critical moment had arrived. He needed reinforcements immediately. He needed overwhelming force concentrated at the exact point where the German spearhead threatened breakthrough. He needed tanks, enormous numbers of tanks, fresh units with full strength that could counterattack with sufficient mass to stop the German advance. The Soviet High Command, the Stavka, responded by committing strategic reserves that had been carefully husbanded precisely for such a crisis. The 5th Guards Tank Army was ordered forward. This formation represented one of the Red Army's elite armoured forces, designated Guards in recognition of exemplary combat performance, consisting of experienced units with good equipment by Soviet standards. Its commander was Lieutenant General Pavel Alexeyevich Rotmistrov, who at 42 years old was remarkably young for such responsibility but had commanded armoured units since before the war and understood both the capabilities and limitations of his equipment with unusual clarity. Rotmistrov received his movement orders on July 9th with instructions that seemed nearly impossible to execute. He was to move his entire army approximately 200 miles westward from its current positions in the Steppe Front Reserve. He was to accomplish this movement in less than 3 days. He was to navigate primitive Russian roads that turned into nearly impassable mud with any rain. He was to avoid detection by German reconnaissance aircraft that controlled the skies during daylight hours. He was to arrive at Prokhorovka with his forces intact, organized, supplied, and ready to conduct immediate offensive operations. It seemed like an impossible mission, but Rotmistrov moved with remarkable speed and organizational capability. The 5th Guards Tank Army consisted of 3 corps-sized formations: the 18th Tank Corps, the 29th Tank Corps, and the 5th Guards Mechanized Corps. Together, these formations fielded approximately 850 tanks and self-propelled guns. The vast majority were T-34 medium tanks, the proven workhorse of Soviet armored forces. Some units included older T-70 light tanks, increasingly obsolete, but still useful for reconnaissance and infantry support. A few units operated British and American Lend-Lease tanks, including Matildas, Valentines, and even a few M4 Shermans. The Mechanized Corps also included motorized infantry and trucks and armored personnel carriers, supporting artillery, anti-tank units, and all the logistical infrastructure necessary to sustain operations. By the evening of July 11th, after a grueling forced march that tested men and machines to their absolute limits, Rotmistrov's forces were moving into assembly areas southwest of Prokhorovka. The movement had been extraordinarily difficult. Dense clouds of dust choked men and engines during daylight movements. Tanks broke down from mechanical stress and had to be recovered or abandoned. Crews were exhausted from constant movement without adequate rest. But they had arrived, more or less on schedule, more or less in the positions where they needed to be. Now they would attack at dawn on July 12th. Rotmistrov's orders from Vatutin were absolutely clear and allowed no ambiguity. Destroy the German armoured forces threatening Prokhorovka. Prevent them from capturing the town. Stop Operation Citadel's advance. Those orders would cost thousands of Soviet lives to execute. On the German side, Hauser's II SS Panzer Corps was also preparing for operations on July 12th. But German intelligence had catastrophically failed to detect the arrival of Rotmistrov's entire army. German reconnaissance had detected some Soviet tank movements, had identified increased radio traffic, suggesting the presence of additional Soviet forces, had noted defensive preparations being strengthened around Prokhorovka, but they had not realized that an entirely fresh Soviet tank army with over 800 armored vehicles had arrived during the previous 48 hours. German commanders expected to be fighting the remnants of already battered Soviet tank brigades, units that had been ground down by a week of intense combat and should be operating at perhaps 1/3 of their original strength. Instead, they were about to encounter fresh Soviet forces deployed in greater numbers than German forces at Prokhorovka had ever faced. Before, in a single engagement, The terrain southwest of Prokhorovka would fundamentally shape how the battle developed. The landscape consisted of gently rolling hills covered in wheat fields that were nearly ready for harvest. The ground was relatively open with few natural obstacles, but there were significant constraints on movement. To the northwest ran the Sel River, a modest waterway perhaps 30 to 40 meters wide with marshy banks. Totenkopf Division had conducted a difficult river crossing and established a precarious bridgehead on the northern bank, where they were now fighting to expand their position against fierce Soviet counterattacks. But most of the German armor remained south of the river. The main avenue of approach to Prokhorovka ran through a relatively narrow corridor, approximately 5 kilometers wide. To the southeast stood a substantial railway embankment, carrying the main rail line into Prokhorovka, its raised bed creating an effective barrier to tank movement. To the northwest flowed the Sel River, with its marshy approaches. Between these obstacles lay the open ground that would become the primary battlefield. This funnel-shaped corridor created significant tactical implications, because both Soviet and German tanks would be channeled into this relatively constrained space. Because German forces had already secured positions on a low ridge designated as Hill 252.2 that overlooked the entire approach corridor, German tank crews would have observation advantages and excellent fields of fire across the Soviet axis of advance. They could engage Soviet tanks at maximum range where German technical advantages in optics, gunnery training, and weapon systems would be most pronounced. Leibstandarte Division held this ridge in considerable strength. Their tanks could see any Soviet force approaching Prokhorovka from the southwest. They could engage targets at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. They could destroy Soviet tanks long before the Soviet forces could effectively return fire. This was exactly the kind of prepared defensive position that German armored doctrine emphasized. Use superior optics and gunnery training to destroy enemy forces at distance. Let the enemy come to you. Kill him before he can close to ranges where his inferior but more numerous forces might overwhelm your technical superiority through sheer mass. But Rotmistrov's battle plan did not rely on long-range gunnery exchanges where German advantages would be decisive. He understood with perfect clarity that the T-34's 76mm gun was completely inadequate for penetrating a Tiger tank's frontal armor at typical combat ranges. He knew that German tanks mounted superior optics that provided better target acquisition at distance. He knew that German tank crews had substantially more gunnery training and demonstrated consistently better shooting at longer ranges. So Rotmistrov planned to negate all of those advantages through an aggressive tactic that was brutal in its simplicity and terrible in its anticipated costs. He would charge. He would order his tank units to attack at maximum speed directly toward the German positions. He would close the range so rapidly that German tank crews would have minimal time to exploit their technical advantages. He would get in among the Tigers and Panthers, where maneuverability became more important than armor thickness and gun power, where the T-34's superior mobility and faster turret traverse might provide tactical advantages, where weight of numbers would begin to tell as multiple. Soviet tanks could coordinate to engage single German vehicles from multiple angles simultaneously. It was an incredibly brutal plan that would cost hundreds of Soviet tanks and thousands of Soviet lives. But Rotmistrov believed it was the only tactical approach that offered reasonable prospects for stopping the German advance. And at the strategic level, he was almost certainly correct. The Germans were attempting to maintain offensive momentum. They needed to keep advancing, keep pushing forward, keep breaking through successive defensive lines, force them into a massive close-range melee, pin them down with overwhelming numbers, make them fight desperately for every meter of ground, inflict heavy casualties even while accepting heavy casualties yourself. And eventually, inevitably, the German advance would stall, because even the finest tanks cannot fight indefinitely without resupply. Even the most experienced crews become exhausted after hours of continuous combat. Even the best tactical training and the most sophisticated technology can be overwhelmed by sufficient mass intelligently applied. Dawn arrived at approximately 5 o'clock on the morning of July 12. The Soviet artillery barrage commenced at precisely 6:15. Hundreds of guns concentrated on a relatively narrow front opened fire simultaneously. Field guns, howitzers, heavy mortars, and the distinctive Katyusha rocket launchers that Soviet troops called Stalin's organs, because of their devastating effect and distinctive sound, all contributed to the bombardment. The fire was intense but not particularly accurate by later war standards. Most shells fell on empty ground behind the German forward positions or struck rear areas where they caused minimal immediate damage to German combat units. But the barrage served multiple important purposes. It signaled unmistakably that something major was about to happen. It suppressed German observation posts and forward positions. It created confusion and disruption in German command and control. And psychologically, it announced that the Soviets were about to attack in strength. At precisely 6:30 in the morning, Rotmistrov transmitted the attack order that had been carefully prearranged. "Steel! Steel! Steel!" The code word went out on multiple radio frequencies simultaneously. From their assembly areas positioned in shallow valleys and behind the crest lines southwest and south of Prokhorovka, Soviet tank units began moving forward in waves that had been carefully organized in advance. The 29th Tank Corps in the center would drive directly toward Prokhorovka. The 18th Tank Corps would advance slightly northwest of the 29th. Together, these two corps would strike the main German defensive positions held by Leibstandarte. Further south, the 2nd Tank Corps and 2nd Guards Tank Corps, operating under 5th Guards Tank Army control, although not part of its permanent structure, would engage Das Reich Division and prevent German forces from shifting northward to reinforce against the main Soviet attack. The German forward observers positioned on Hill 252.2 saw the Soviet attack developing almost immediately despite the dust and morning haze. At first, they detected the characteristic dust clouds raised by large numbers of tanks moving cross-country. Then individual vehicles became visible emerging from the morning mist, T-34s predominantly, moving in irregular waves, dozens visible initially, then hundreds, then so many that attempts at counting became meaningless. A German tank commander in Leibstandarte's 1st SS Panzer Regiment, SS Hauptsturmführer Rudolf von Ribbentrop, later wrote in his memoir that watching the Soviet attack develop was like observing a dark tide roll across the landscape, like watching a tsunami of steel approaching your position, like facing a force of nature rather than an enemy army. The sheer scale was overwhelming, even for experienced veterans who had fought across Poland, France, the Balkans, and Russia. They had never seen so many enemy tanks concentrated in such a relatively confined space attacking simultaneously. The German gunners opened fire at approximately 2,000 meters, essentially maximum effective range for the 75mm guns mounted on the Panzer IV tanks that formed the numerical backbone of German armoured strength. The Tigers could engage at even greater ranges with their superior optics and more powerful guns. The first Soviet tanks began to burn almost immediately. The T-34 had revolutionary sloped armour on its frontal glacis plate that provided excellent protection for its weight class. But its side armour was relatively thin, perhaps 45mm compared to the frontal armour's 47mm, but without the benefit of sloping. The turret armour was also vulnerable, particularly the turret ring, where the turret joined the hull. A hit anywhere except the frontal glacis or the gun mantlet could potentially be catastrophic. German tank crews were superbly trained and aimed deliberately for these vulnerable points. They targeted the ammunition stored around the T-34's turret ring. When they achieved a direct hit there, the results were spectacular and terrible. The tank would explode violently as the stored ammunition detonated. Flames would shoot 20 or 30 meters straight up into the air. The turret would sometimes blow completely off the hull and land dozens of meters away. Crew members caught inside had essentially zero chance of survival. But the Soviet tanks continued advancing without slowing, without seeking cover, without deviating from their ordered attack axes. Soviet armored doctrine for offensive operations explicitly prescribed attacking at maximum possible speed to minimize the time enemy forces had available for aimed fire. Don't give the opponent time to carefully aim, to precisely calculate range, to adjust fire. Just charge forward and close the distance as rapidly as mechanically possible. For Soviet tank crews, the experience must have been absolutely terrifying beyond easy comprehension. They could see their comrades dying in burning tanks all around them. They could see T-34s exploding into fireballs. They could see crews attempting to bail out and being cut down by German machine gun fire. But their orders were explicit and allowed no deviation. Keep moving forward. Maintain formation. Close with the enemy. The Soviet military system did not encourage initiative or deviation from orders. Commanders who failed to execute orders faced potential court-martial. Units that failed to accomplish assigned missions faced severe consequences. So the Soviet tank crews kept advancing despite the casualties, despite the terror, despite everything. Instincts screamed about seeking cover or falling back. The Germans were firing as rapidly as physical limitations allowed. A Tiger's main gun could theoretically fire approximately 6 to 7 rounds per minute in ideal conditions. But combat conditions are never ideal. In practice, a good crew might manage 3 or 4 aimed shots per minute, perhaps 5 in absolute emergency. Each round required careful loading by the loader working in the cramped confines of the turret. The gunner had to track the target through his optics, account for target movement, estimate range, calculate the appropriate sight picture, and then fire when the target was properly aligned in the reticle. Immediately after firing, the gunner had to identify the next priority target and begin the tracking process again. The commander had to manage the engagement, assign targets, maintain awareness of the tactical situation, coordinate with other tanks in the platoon, monitor the radio. It was mentally and physically exhausting work conducted under extraordinary stress. At approximately 1,500 meters range, the advancing Soviet tanks entered the effective engagement range for their own main guns. The 76mm F-34 tank gun, mounted on the T-34, had reasonable armor-piercing performance against German medium tanks at this range. It couldn't penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor even at point-blank range, but it could potentially damage tracks, could knock out vision devices, could sometimes penetrate the thinner side armor if a tank was angled improperly, could keep German crews buttoned up inside their vehicles under constant fire. And occasionally, with luck or exceptional gunnery, a Soviet round would find a vulnerable spot. The turret ring, where armor coverage was necessarily thinner to allow turret rotation. The gun mantlet, where the main gun penetrated the turret front. The driver's vision port, the junction between turret and hull. When a Soviet round did penetrate, even a Tiger could be catastrophically damaged or destroyed. The two opposing armored forces came together in the ground, immediately west and southwest of Prokhorovka during the hours between 8 and 10 o'clock on the morning of July 12th. By that time, hundreds of tanks were engaged in close combat that dissolved organized formations into chaotic individual engagements. German tanks maneuvered constantly seeking flanking angles on Soviet vehicles. Soviet tanks attempted to use their slightly superior mobility to get around heavier but slower German tanks. Infantry emerged from cover to engage tanks with anti-tank rifles, grenades, or magnetic mines. Artillery fire from both sides fell across the entire battlefield without regard for the confused tactical situation. The dust and smoke became so thick that visibility in many areas dropped to 50 meters or less. Tank crews lost their orientation completely. Soviet tanks found themselves accidentally engaging other Soviet tanks in the confusion. German tanks engaged what they thought were enemy vehicles, only to discover they were firing at already destroyed and burning hulks. Alexander Fedorovich Oskin, a Soviet tank battalion commander, described the chaos in his post-war memoir with vivid clarity. "You couldn't tell who was winning," he wrote. "You couldn't maintain formation. You couldn't execute doctrine. You just fought whatever target presented itself in front of your tank at any given moment." Oskin's T-34 came around a burning German Panzer IV and nearly collided with a Tiger tank at a range of perhaps 30 meters. The German crew was apparently surprised by the sudden appearance. Oskin's driver had no time to maneuver. Oskin traversed his turret frantically, shouting at his gunner to fire immediately without carefully aiming. They were so close that the engagement became essentially point blank. Oskin's gunner fired. The round penetrated the Tiger's relatively thin side armor and presumably hit something critical inside. The German tank caught fire, and its crew began bailing out immediately. Oskin's driver threw the T-34 into reverse, desperately trying to back away before the Tiger's ammunition cooked off. In reversing, they nearly collided with another Tiger that neither the driver nor Oskin had seen approaching from behind. Oskin's gunner, working purely on instinct, fired again without bothering to aim carefully. Another hit on a German tank's vulnerable side armor. Another vehicle burning. Oskin survived that day with 5 confirmed tank kills. But his T-34 was effectively a wreck by the time he managed to get back to Soviet lines that evening. The armor was pockmarked with dozens of impact scars from German tank guns and anti-tank weapons. The tracks were so badly damaged the tank could barely move. One of the road wheels had been completely shot off. The turret traverse mechanism was damaged and barely functional. Oskin's hands shook so badly afterward that he couldn't hold a cigarette steady enough to light it, and he had been a tank commander for over a year by that point. The Germans were equally shocked by the sheer intensity and unprecedented scale of the Soviet attack. SS Hauptsturmführer Rudolf von Ribbentrop commanded the 6th Company of Leibstandartes 1st SS Panzer Regiment. His company began the day with 7 operational tanks. By noon, only 3 were still mobile and combat capable, 1 Tiger and 2 Panzer IVs. The remainder had been knocked out, damaged or destroyed. But Ribbentrop and his remaining tank crews continued holding their defensive positions on Hill 252-2, from which vantage point they maintained observation over the battlefield and continued engaging Soviet tanks throughout the afternoon. Von Ribbentrop wrote in his memoir that the Soviets demonstrated almost incomprehensible bravery, or perhaps desperation, even after suffering appalling casualties, even after losing hundreds of tanks, even after multiple attacks had been shattered. They just continued attacking. Wave after wave of Soviet armor kept coming forward. It seemed like madness, but it was methodical, deliberate, and ultimately effective tactics designed to achieve strategic objectives regardless of immediate tactical costs. The fighting was not confined solely to the main corridor southwest of Prokhorovka, where the 29th and 18th Tank Corps engaged Leibstandarte Division. North of the Sel River, Totenkopf Division found itself engaged with elements of the Soviet 5th Guards Mechanized Corps and various supporting units that were attacking the precarious German bridgehead. The combat there was equally intense, equally brutal, and equally confused. The terrain north of the river was more restrictive with marshy ground, scattered woods, and more broken ground that limited tank mobility. But both sides fed forces into the fight throughout the day. South of the main battle, Das Reich Division was heavily engaged with the Soviet 2nd Tank Corps and 2nd Guards Tank Corps. Here too, the fighting dissolved into confused close-range engagements, where individual tank duels and small unit actions determined outcomes rather than grand tactical maneuvers. Essentially, everywhere along a front stretching approximately 15 to 20 kilometers from north to south, and perhaps 10 kilometers deep, Soviet and German armor clashed in the largest concentrated tank battle of World War II. By midday on July 12th, both sides were physically and mentally exhausted. The Germans had stopped the main Soviet attacks from achieving their immediate objective of destroying German armored forces and driving them away from Prokhorovka. German defensive positions on Hill 252.2 and other key terrain remained in German hands. But the Germans had completely failed to break through to Prokhorovka itself. They had not captured the town. They had not secured the road network beyond. They had not created opportunities for further advance. The momentum of Operation Citadel had been definitively stopped. The Soviets had similarly failed to achieve their stated objective of destroying the German armored forces. The II SS Panzer Corps remained combat effective, still held its positions, still retained organizational coherence, but strategically, the Soviets had accomplished their essential goal. They had stopped the German offensive. They had prevented the breakthrough that might have led to the collapse of the entire southern front. The losses on both sides were substantial, but dramatically asymmetric. Modern historical research conducted since the end of the Cold War, using German and Soviet archival documents that were unavailable to earlier historians, has established casualty figures that are substantially different from the propaganda claims circulated by both sides during and immediately after the war. The Germans lost somewhere between 60 and 80 tanks and assault guns destroyed or seriously damaged. During the fighting on July 12th, that total included approximately 1 Tiger tank that was completely destroyed and could not be recovered or repaired, plus several other Tigers that were temporarily knocked out but were subsequently repaired and returned to service within a few days. For an elite Panzer Corps, these represented significant losses that degraded combat capability, but they were sustainable losses. The units remained organized. Command and control remained functional. By July 13th, most of the damaged tanks had been recovered and either repaired or cannibalized for parts, with the majority of temporarily disabled tanks returning to operational status within 48 to 72 hours. The Soviet losses were catastrophically higher by comparison. The 5th Guards Tank Army lost somewhere between 300 and 400 tanks completely destroyed, burned out, or abandoned on the battlefield during July 12th. This represented nearly half of the Army's initial strength lost in a single day of combat. Many additional tanks were damaged to varying degrees, with some requiring only minor repairs, but others requiring extensive work or complete rebuilding. By the evening of July 12th, entire Soviet tank brigades that had started the day with 50 or 60 tanks could assemble only 10 or 15 operational vehicles. The human casualties were even more devastating than the material losses. Soviet sources that have become available since the collapse of the Soviet Union suggest that the 5th Guards Tank Army suffered somewhere between 5 8,000 casualties during the Battle of Prokhorovka, with casualties defined as killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Thousands of Soviet tank crewmen died that day. Many burned alive inside steel coffins as their tanks caught fire and ammunition detonated. Many were killed by machine gun fire when they tried to bail out of disabled or burning vehicles. Many were killed by artillery fire while attempting to fight on foot after their tanks were destroyed. Some units lost more than half their personnel strength in a matter of hours. For decades after the war, Soviet historians and military leaders propagandized Prokhorovka as one of the great decisive victories of the Great Patriotic War. They claimed the Germans had lost 300, 400, sometimes even 500 tanks at Prokhorovka. They claimed that II SS Panzer Corps had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force. They claimed this single battle marked the definitive turning point when German offensive capability was broken forever. All of that was propaganda designed to serve political purposes within the Soviet system and to support the narrative that Soviet military genius and Soviet fighting spirit had defeated the Nazi war machine. The historical truth was substantially more complicated and more interesting. Yes, the Soviets had suffered terrible losses at Prokhorovka. Yes, by any tactical metric, the Germans had won the immediate engagement decisively, killing far more enemy tanks than they lost, maintaining their defensive positions, preserving their unit integrity and combat capability. But strategically and operationally, Prokhorovka represented a decisive Soviet victory precisely because the Germans had been stopped. Operation Citadel depended absolutely on maintaining offensive momentum, on breaking through successive defensive belts, on reaching objectives according to ambitious timetables, on encircling Soviet forces before they could retreat or be reinforced. Prokhorovka prevented all of that from happening. The II SS Panzer Corps was pinned down in heavy fighting. They couldn't capture Prokhorovka. They couldn't advance northeast toward Kursk. They couldn't link up with Model's 9th Army attacking from the north. The offensive had stalled completely. And in mobile offensive operations, stalling means failure, regardless of tactical kill ratios. Time was working systematically against Germany with every passing hour. Every day Operation Citadel continued without achieving its objectives. More Soviet reserve formations arrived at the front. More defensive positions were prepared. More anti-tank guns were positioned. More mines were laid. More artillery was registered on likely German axes of advance. The Germans were consuming their limited strength, using up irreplaceable ammunition, burning fuel they increasingly couldn't afford to waste, wearing out men and machines without achieving strategic goals. Meanwhile, the Soviets had effectively unlimited reserves compared to German capabilities. They could afford to trade space for time. They could afford to accept heavy casualties in defensive battles. They could afford to commit strategic reserves to stop German penetrations. The fundamental asymmetry in industrial and population resources meant that while Germany might win individual battles, the Soviet Union would win the campaign and ultimately the war. The Battle of Prokhorovka demonstrated with brutal clarity that sheer numerical superiority, intelligently applied, could overcome qualitative advantages in equipment and training. German tanks were unquestionably superior to Soviet tanks in virtually every measurable technical parameter. German tank crews had substantially more training and demonstrated consistently better gunnery at range. German tactical doctrine was more sophisticated and better suited to armoured warfare. German officers were more experienced and generally more capable, but none of that mattered decisively when facing overwhelming numbers employed according to sound operational principles. A Tiger tank might be nearly invulnerable at 2,000 meters range, but when surrounded by half a dozen T-34s maneuvering at close range, even a Tiger could be flanked and destroyed. The Soviets had discovered a tactical method to negate German technological superiority, accept the casualties required to close to short range, use mass to overwhelm technical advantages, trade tanks for strategic results. It was brutal, it was expensive, but it worked. This was precisely the kind of warfare that played to Soviet strengths and exploited German weaknesses. The Soviet Union had lost approximately 20 million people by the end of the war. Though exact figures remain disputed and uncertain, it had lost entire armies early in the war, had seen millions of soldiers killed or captured during the catastrophic defeats of 1941. But the Soviet system could absorb those horrific losses because of the USSR's vast population, because of Stalin's willingness to accept any level of casualties necessary to achieve victory, and critically because of the Soviet Union's extraordinary industrial capacity that had been painstakingly, brutally developed during the 1930s. By 1943, Soviet factories were producing vastly more tanks, vastly more artillery, vastly more aircraft than Germany could possibly match. The T-34 might not match a Tiger in a one-on-one duel, but if Soviet industry could build 15 T-34s for every Tiger Germany produced, you didn't need to match German technical quality. You could overwhelm it with sheer quantity intelligently applied. For Germany, Prokhorovka provided a grim preview of what was coming in the years ahead. From July 1943 forward, Germany would be permanently on the defensive on the Eastern Front. The strategic initiative had passed to the Soviet Union and would never return. Every German victory from this point forward would be tactical, would involve excellent small unit leadership, would demonstrate superior crew training and superior equipment, would result in favorable kill ratios. But none of that would stop the Soviet advance. None of that would prevent the Red Army from eventually reaching Berlin, because the Red Army had more tanks than Germany could ever destroy, more artillery than Germany could ever suppress, more soldiers than Germany could ever kill, more industrial capacity than Germany could ever match. The mathematics were inexorable and inescapable. The technological arms race between German and Soviet tank design that culminated at Prokhorovka represented fundamentally different philosophies of industrial warfare. These competing approaches revealed deep truths about how nations organize their military-industrial complexes, how they prioritize resources between quality and quantity, and how technological excellence interacts with manufacturing capacity in determining strategic outcomes. Understanding these differences provides crucial insights not just into World War II, but into the broader dynamics of industrialized total war. German tank development emphasized technical sophistication, engineering excellence, and qualitative superiority over potential opponents. This approach reflected deeply rooted aspects of German industrial culture. German engineers had long taken pride in producing the finest machinery in the world. German manufacturing emphasized precision, craftsmanship, individual worker skill. German military culture valued elite formations, superior training, technological edge. The Tiger tank epitomized this philosophy. It was an engineering masterpiece. Every component was carefully designed. The armor was precisely machined and properly hardened through sophisticated heat treatment. The transmission was complex but provided smooth operation. The engine delivered reliable power. The gun was magnificently accurate. The optics were the finest in the world. A Tiger represented hundreds of hours of skilled labor, thousands of precision machine parts, sophisticated metallurgy, and cutting-edge engineering. But this approach had inherent limitations that became glaringly obvious at Prokhorovka and throughout the latter half of the war. The Tiger required chrome, molybdenum, and other strategic materials that Germany increasingly lacked access to as the war continued. Its complex transmission required specialized manufacturing facilities that couldn't easily be expanded. Its sophisticated engine demanded precision machining that took significant time. Each Tiger took approximately 300,000 man-hours to complete from start to finish. Production facilities could manufacture at most 20 to 25 Tigers monthly regardless of demand. When a Tiger was damaged in combat, repairs often required specialized parts that could take weeks to manufacture and deliver to frontline units. The mechanical complexity that made the Tiger so formidable also made it prone to breakdowns, particularly when operated under the harsh conditions of the Eastern Front. Soviet tank design philosophy represented almost the complete opposite approach. Soviet engineers designed the T-34 to be adequate rather than excellent, good enough rather than perfect. The armor was sloped for maximum effectiveness, but was often of inconsistent quality, with manufacturing defects that would have been unacceptable in German production facilities. The gun was effective, but not as precisely manufactured as German weapons. The optics were functional, but substantially inferior to German equivalents. The interior was cramped and uncomfortable. The crew arrangements were awkward. The transmission was prone to mechanical problems. But none of that mattered strategically, because the T-34 could be manufactured in vast quantities using relatively unskilled labor in factories that lacked sophisticated equipment. Soviet manufacturing emphasized speed over precision, quantity over quality, acceptable performance over optimal performance. T-34 production facilities were often crude by Western standards. Workers might have minimal training. Manufacturing equipment might be worn and imprecise. Quality control was inconsistent. But Soviet factories could turn out T-34s in absolutely staggering numbers. A T-34 required perhaps 1/10 the specialized labor of a Tiger. It used less scarce materials, It could be manufactured in facilities that weren't highly specialized. When components wore out or were damaged, they could be quickly replaced from abundant supplies. When a T-34 was destroyed, another could be delivered to the front. Within days rather than weeks, this fundamental difference in manufacturing philosophy determined the outcome at Prokhorovka and shaped the entire trajectory of the Eastern Front War. Germany entered the battle with perhaps 300 tanks, many of them technically superior to anything the Soviets fielded. But they couldn't replace losses quickly, couldn't expand production significantly, couldn't overcome the fundamental arithmetic of industrial capacity. The Soviets arrived with over 800 tanks, most of them inferior to German vehicles in technical specifications. But Soviet industry could replace losses within days, could expand production continuously throughout the war, could overwhelm German qualitative advantages through sheer quantitative superiority. The human dimension of this technological competition was equally important and often overlooked in purely technical analyses. German tank crews were extensively trained, with training programs that might last 6 months or more before a crew was considered combat ready. German commanders emphasized tactical flexibility, individual initiative, sophisticated gunnery techniques. A German Tiger crew might spend weeks practicing long-range gunnery, learning to estimate distances accurately, adjusting for wind and temperature, accounting for ammunition variations. This training made German tank crews devastatingly effective in combat, but it also meant that experienced crews were irreplaceable assets. When a veteran crew was killed, the replacement crew required months of training to achieve comparable effectiveness. Germany simply couldn't produce enough highly trained crews to match Soviet numerical superiority. Soviet tank training was substantially shorter and less sophisticated. A Soviet tank crew might receive only weeks of basic training before being sent to the front. Gunnery training was rudimentary by German standards. Tactical training emphasized simple, repeatable procedures rather than flexible adaptation. But this approach had significant advantages in total war conditions. Soviet training programs could produce crews rapidly. Losses could be replaced quickly. The simple tactics Soviet forces employed didn't require extensive training to execute competently. A Soviet commander didn't need his crews to be able to conduct complex maneuvers or sophisticated gunnery. He needed them to be able to drive their tanks forward, maintain formation, and fire their weapons at close range. Those tasks could be taught quickly to conscripts with minimal prior education or military experience. The Battle of Prokhorovka demonstrated that in industrial total war, the ability to rapidly produce adequate equipment and adequately trained crews trumps the ability to slowly produce excellent equipment and extensively trained crews. This lesson has profound implications that extend well beyond World War II. It suggests that in conflicts between industrialized nations, manufacturing capacity and the ability to rapidly scale production becomes more strategically important than achieving technical superiority in individual weapon systems. It implies that military organizations must balance the pursuit of technical excellence against the need for systems that can be manufactured and maintained at scale. It indicates that training programs must consider not just how to produce highly skilled specialists, but how to rapidly produce minimally competent operators who can execute simple but effective tactics. These principles applied at Prokhorovka apply to contemporary military conflicts as well. Modern military forces face similar trade-offs between technical sophistication and manufacturing capacity, between extensive training and rapid personnel replacement, between optimizing individual system performance and optimizing overall force capabilities. The F-35 fighter aircraft program, for instance, mirrors many aspects of German Tiger development. It represents extraordinary technical sophistication, incorporates cutting-edge technology, provides capabilities that exceed any potential opponent. But it's extraordinarily expensive, difficult to manufacture, requires extensive maintenance, and is produced in numbers that may prove inadequate for large-scale conflict. Alternative approaches emphasizing simpler, more easily manufactured systems that can be produced in larger quantities might prove more strategically effective if tested in actual combat conditions comparable to Prokhorovka. Beyond the immediate tactical and strategic lessons, Prokhorovka illuminates deeper questions about how societies mobilize for total war and what costs they're willing to accept in pursuit of victory. The Soviet Union's ability to produce thousands of tanks and accept tens of thousands of casualties reflected a political and social system that could impose enormous sacrifices on its population without facing domestic opposition. Stalin's totalitarian state could conscript millions of men, could force workers to labor in brutal conditions in armaments factories, could accept casualty levels that would have been politically intolerable in democratic societies. The Battle of Prokhorovka was fought with tanks that Soviet workers had built under extraordinarily difficult conditions. Many of those workers were women and teenagers because adult men were serving in the military. Many worked 12-hour shifts or longer. Conditions in Soviet arms factories during the war were harsh, dangerous, sometimes lethal. But Soviet industry continued producing because the alternative was national extinction. Germany faced similar pressures and employed similarly brutal methods. German war production relied heavily on slave labor from conquered territories and concentration camps. German workers faced long hours and difficult conditions, but Germany never achieved the same level of total industrial mobilization that characterized the Soviet war effort. German society retained elements of peacetime normalcy throughout much of the war. Consumer goods production continued longer than it should have. Labor was never as comprehensively mobilized as in the USSR. Resources were allocated inefficiently across competing military programs. The German system, despite its authoritarian nature, couldn't impose the same level of total sacrifice that the Soviet system could extract from its population. This difference manifested itself at Prokhorovka in the stark disparity in available forces. The Soviets could field over 800 tanks because their society had been completely subordinated to military production. Germany fielded 300 because their mobilization, while extensive, was incomplete. The battle's outcome reflected not just technical capabilities or tactical execution, but fundamental differences in how completely each society had organized itself for total war. The lessons from this extend beyond military history into broader questions about state capacity, social organization, and the relationship between political systems and military effectiveness. The aftermath of Prokhorovka also reveals important truths about how societies remember and interpret military history. For decades, Soviet historians and political leaders portrayed the battle as an overwhelming victory, claimed massive German losses, emphasized Soviet tactical brilliance. This narrative served important political purposes within the Soviet system. It reinforced the legitimacy of the Communist Party by associating it with military success. It provided heroic narratives that could inspire patriotism and sacrifice. It helped justify the enormous casualties the Soviet Union had suffered by framing them as necessary costs of ultimate victory. The truth that Soviet losses at Prokhorovka vastly exceeded German losses didn't fit this narrative and was therefore suppressed or denied. Only after the collapse of the Soviet Union did Russian and Western historians gain access to archival materials that revealed the true casualty figures. The revelation that Soviet propaganda had systematically distorted historical reality for decades was sobering, but not surprising. All nations engage in some degree of historical myth-making, particularly regarding military conflicts. The United States has its own carefully curated narratives about World War II that emphasize American contributions while minimizing Soviet sacrifices. Britain maintains narratives about standing alone against Nazi Germany that overlook the crucial importance of the Eastern Front. Every nation tells stories about its past that serve present, political purposes, but the extreme disparity between Soviet propaganda about Prokhorovka and the historical reality revealed in archival documents reminds us to approach military history with appropriate skepticism. Official casualty figures may be unreliable, victory claims may be exaggerated, accounts written shortly after battles may reflect propaganda purposes more than factual accuracy. Good military history requires careful source criticism, comparison of multiple accounts, and recognition that all sources reflect particular perspectives and biases. The truth about Prokhorovka emerged only decades after the battle, only after political systems changed sufficiently to permit honest historical inquiry. The physical battlefield at Prokhorovka today offers its own lessons about memory and history. The Soviet government erected monuments celebrating the great victory at Prokhorovka. These monuments present the official Soviet narrative that has little relationship to historical reality. They claim massive German losses. They celebrate Soviet tactical brilliance. They present the battle as a turning point comparable to Stalingrad. Russian visitors to these monuments today are encountering propaganda rather than history. But the monuments themselves have become historical artifacts, revealing how the Soviet state shaped collective memory, how it used military history to legitimize its rule, how it constructed narratives about the great, patriotic war that continued to influence Russian national identity decades after the Soviet Union's collapse. The International Museum that opened at Prokhorovka in the post-Soviet era attempts a more balanced presentation. It acknowledges Soviet casualties were severe. It presents German archival materials alongside Soviet sources. It allows visitors to form their own judgments about what happened and what it meant. But even this more balanced presentation faces challenges. Russian nationalism continues to value the narrative of glorious Soviet military achievements, acknowledging that Soviet forces suffered far heavier losses than German forces at Prokhorovka feels, to some Russians, like diminishing the sacrifices of the Soviet soldiers who fought there. The tension between historical accuracy and national pride remains unresolved. For military professionals studying Prokhorovka today, the battle offers enduring lessons about combined arms warfare, the importance of reconnaissance, the challenges of coordinating large-scale armored operations, the difficulties of maintaining command and control in fluid combat situations. Soviet forces at Prokhorovka suffered from inadequate reconnaissance that failed to properly identify German defensive positions. Their attacks were insufficiently coordinated with artillery support. Infantry and armor cooperation was poor. Command and control broke down rapidly once the battle began. All of these failures contributed to the heavy Soviet casualties. Modern military forces study Prokhorovka to understand these persistent challenges in armored warfare and to develop better solutions. The technological evolution that began at Prokhorovka continued throughout the remaining war years. The T-34 was upgraded with an 85mm gun that provided better armor penetration, creating the T-34-85 variant that appeared in late 1943 and early 1944. This improved version could penetrate even Tiger armor at reasonable ranges, providing Soviet tank crews with more confidence in engaging German heavy armor. The Soviets also fielded the IS-2 heavy tank with its massive 122mm gun, providing their own counter to German Tigers and Panthers. But the fundamental dynamics established at Prokhorovka remained unchanged. German tanks continued to be technically superior on average. Soviet tanks continued to be produced in far greater numbers, and quantity continued to trump quality in determining strategic outcomes. Germany responded to the T-34-85 and IS-2 by developing even heavier armor. The Tiger II, weighing nearly 70 tons with frontal armor up to 7 inches thick, represented the ultimate expression of German heavy tank philosophy. But only about 400 were built during the entire war. The Jagd Panther tank destroyer and Jag Tiger super heavy tank destroyer provided even more powerful guns and heavier armor, but in even smaller numbers. These vehicles were formidable in combat, but strategically irrelevant because they existed in quantities too small to affect the overall course of operations. The pattern established at Prokhorovka repeated itself throughout 1944 and 1945. German armor achieved impressive tactical successes, but couldn't prevent Soviet strategic advances because the Red Army could replace losses while Germany could not. The human legacy of Prokhorovka extends beyond casualty statistics and tactical analyses. Thousands of young men died in that wheat field on July 12, 1943. They left behind widows, orphans, parents who mourned them for the rest of their lives. Soviet society in the post-war years was shaped profoundly by the massive losses it had suffered during the war. Nearly every family had lost someone. Veterans carried physical and psychological scars. The demographic imbalance created by the war, far fewer men than women in the generation that fought, affected Soviet society for decades. The trauma of the war influenced Soviet foreign policy, Soviet military doctrine, Soviet political culture. The determination never to be invaded again, never to suffer such losses again, drove Soviet military build-up during the Cold War. Germany's losses, while smaller in absolute terms, were equally devastating given Germany's smaller population. The destruction of the German military at Prokhorovka and throughout the Eastern Front campaign meant that Germany lost an entire generation of military-age men. The moral catastrophe of Nazi Germany's crimes meant that German veterans of the Eastern Front returned home to a society that had committed genocide, that had started a war of annihilation, that bore responsibility for unimaginable evil. German memory of the Eastern Front remains complicated, contested, burdened by knowledge of what the Wehrmacht was fighting for and what crimes were committed in its name. The Battle of Prokhorovka stands as one of the pivotal engagements of World War II, not because of any single dramatic moment or decisive tactical innovation, but because it crystallized fundamental truths about modern industrialized warfare. It demonstrated that industrial capacity matters more than technical sophistication when both sides can field large, reasonably effective military forces. It showed that quantity has a quality all its own when intelligently applied. It proved that accepting heavy casualties to achieve strategic objectives can be rational if your society can sustain those losses while your opponent cannot. It revealed that offensive operations in the age of modern firepower require either overwhelming numerical superiority or technological advantages so pronounced that they cannot be overcome by mass. And it illustrated that even the finest soldiers with the best equipment cannot indefinitely sustain offensive operations against determined opposition backed by superior resources. These lessons, learned at terrible cost in the wheat fields southwest of Prokhorovka on a summer morning in 1943, remain relevant to contemporary military planning. They inform debates about procurement priorities, about force structure, about training programs, about operational doctrine. They remind us that war remains ultimately a contest between societies, between industrial systems, between competing approaches to organizing human and material resources. Technology matters enormously. Training matters enormously. Leadership matters enormously. But underlying all of these factors is the fundamental question of industrial and demographic capacity. Can you build enough weapons? Can you sustain enough forces in the field? Can you replace losses? Can you maintain operations over extended periods? These unglamorous questions of industrial, organization and resource management often prove more decisive than brilliant tactics or technological breakthroughs. The young men who fought at Prokhorovka could not have known they were participating in a battle that would be studied and analyzed for generations. They were focused on survival, on executing orders, on doing their duty to their nations. German tank crews believed they were defending European civilization against Bolshevism. Soviet tank crews believed they were defending their homeland against fascist invaders. Both sides believed their cause was just. Both sides fought with courage. Both sides suffered terribly. History has rendered its judgment on the broader conflict, has condemned the Nazi regime and its wars of aggression and genocide, has recognized the Soviet Union's crucial role in defeating that regime despite Stalin's own crimes. But the individual soldiers who fought at Prokhorovka deserve to be remembered not as propaganda symbols or historical abstractions, but as human beings caught up in forces beyond their control, who fought and died because their nations and their times demanded it of them. The smoke has long since cleared from the battlefield at Prokhorovka. The burned-out tanks have been removed or buried. The wheat grows again where hundreds of men died. But the battle's significance endures, offering lessons about technology and tactics, about industrial capacity and strategic planning, about how nations organize for total war and what costs they bear in pursuit of victory. These lessons transcend the specific circumstances of World War II, speaking to enduring truths about warfare, about industrial society, about human nature under extreme stress. They remind us that war's outcome is determined not just by the courage of soldiers or the brilliance of commanders, but by the productive capacity of societies, by the ability to manufacture weapons and train soldiers faster than your opponent can destroy them, by the willingness to accept sacrifices that may seem unbearable in pursuit of objectives deemed essential. These are not comfortable lessons, but they remain true across time and circumstance, as relevant now as they were on that terrible morning when hundreds of tanks charged across the summer wheat toward an enemy that awaited them on the hills beyond.